Exchange your t-shirt. That's a reminder to do that too.
Congratulations on your award.
What? Thank you. It's definitely not mine.
Well, why not?
I was like, Claudia, I don't have anything to do with this. What? She's like, yes, you do. But I didn't, the research team is
Yeah.
a whole other set of.
Olivia's going to be timing us.
Okay.
Oh, excellent.
April, I think you should stand up and get started. You stand up and get started. You.
Okay.
Because otherwise people are not sitting.
Good morning. Good middle morning. If you could have a seat, we're going to get started. And we're going to be talking about Civic Tech, so it's really exciting. So you might want to sit down for this one. Good. For the past few years, a number of NNIP partners have been part of the Civic Tech and Data Collaborative, and we're going to tell you all about that. And Kathy's going to kick us off with an introduction of the project.
Great. Is that on? Thanks, April. I will. Is my PowerPoint up? I was ready to talk about this thing, and I was like, oh, no, great. Thanks to April's been part of our journey for the past, 2.5, 3, almost 3 years now. So it's great to finally be able to share some at the sort of culminating moment with all of you what our journey has been like. We had a session on this, I think, back in Dallas, which I'm not sure how many of you were here, but it was still very unformed at that point. So I first want to acknowledge this really was an amazing collaborative effort. Olivia was closely working with me here. Elizabeth Reynoso and Katie Baskett are here from Living Cities. Christopher Whitaker couldn't be here from Code for America, but Veronica is here to represent them. So it was, part of the project was really about learning to work together across networks. And I wanted also to thank the MacArthur Foundation that funded the full project. So back in sort of the fall of 2014, we started with a motivating question, sort of how, and I think Seema led right into this, how do we start to do things differently to make more of an impact? How do we start to knit together the data that we know well with the new technologies that we see were flowing and the really increased interest in government agencies in engaging externally and becoming more data-driven. So we had a competition, and there were 7 sites that participated. There were the implementation sites that had proposed a particular project, and you'll hear from Peter and John today about theirs. MAPC couldn't be here today. Their Boston Youth Jobs Boston project that we're happy to talk about afterwards or during questions. And then as a new structure, we had learning partners. So these were folks that maybe didn't know their civic tech people, but were really interested and seemed that they had the sort of nugget of where they wanted to go. And their job was actually just to make connections and start to get to know the landscape locally and figure out where they could contribute. So there are, obviously, if we did ecosystem maps at the library session on Tuesday, and there were a zillion sticky notes with different actors and institutions. But for our project, we asked for there to be, for the implementation partners, 3 core groups. So the NNIP partner, civic technologists, and local government agencies that all proposed how to take on a challenge and social issue in a new way. So I'm going to give you a very high-level view of some lessons from local partners and what we learned nationally. First of all of the cities, as we know from NNIP, structured how to do it differently, depending on where the home organization was, and they also decided how to tap technology differently. In some cases, you'll hear Peter about the brigade. John went through launch code and hackathon organization. So the creativity that came out, and we know a lot more about how to do this. They also pulled in new allies. We learned that technology really was a catalyst, and I think Code for America has seen this in their programs for new relationships and action. So it wasn't so much about that you were using an API or open source. When you started to get into a conversation about, wait a minute, we think the process is broken. We need to really rethink how things are gone. And it gave us a great example on, based off of our workshop coming in Indianapolis, sort of the experience of user-centered design and what the payoff is if you put the investment in into really listening to your user base. Nationally, with Living Cities and Code for America, we had a lot of long conversations about our approaches to community change through our networks and how we support our own local members. And we learned a lot about peer learning, new strategies from Elizabeth and her team and how the brigades work. The communications was a real focus, how to amplify messages. NNIP has not always been, that's not been our strong point in the past. So being with Living Cities and Code for America that are so excellent at communications and telling their story was really helpful. And then finally, this new experiment about different ways to engage in the cross-site project, I think we're going to take forward to other projects. So we are doing our launch in early June with these various products. There'll be an overview paper. Olivia and Crystal have worked on an ecosystem mapping guide based on the local experiences. We have in-depth case studies on each of those, on each of the local sites, as well as a more internally looking guide for all of you about how do we as data intermediaries engage with the Civic Tech movement. And Katie's been working also really hard on a toolkit for resources that will be based in Medium because we knew we weren't experts in all of these different pieces. So I think Olivia put up a camp session that I'll put a plug in for if you want to talk more in depth. We know this hour won't be really enough to dive in, but hopefully we'll give you a good sense of how it really worked in St. Louis and in DC. I don't know, who's going first? I forget. You could flip for it.
Great, thank you, Kathy. Good morning, everyone. Again, my name is Peter Tatian. I'm at the Urban Institute. I'm the research director for Urban Greater DC, and I should just say a note. So Urban Greater DC is our new branding at Urban for all of our local work in DC and the Washington region. So I know some of you may not be familiar with that, but that's going forward. That's how we're doing our work. And this project, Housing Insights, comes out of a lot of work that we have been doing for a number of years in DC around the need for affordable housing in our city and in our region. DC is a very high-cost area, and lots of affordable housing has been lost or is threatened with being lost. And so preserving that affordable housing has been a big concern for us and a number of partners for some time now. So we were really grateful to have this opportunity. I want to thank the national partners for creating this opportunity because we had never done a civic technology project before. And so this was a great learning opportunity for us to actually have that experience. The partners that we worked with on this project were some folks, again, that we have worked with in the past. So the Coalition for Nonprofit Housing and Economic Development, which is an umbrella group in DC of affordable housing providers and housing assistance groups. We've worked with them for a number of years around preservation of affordable housing and help organize the DC Preservation Network with them. We also partnered with the DC government's Department of Housing Community Development. They're the city agency that is really the focus for a lot of the housing policy and programs that go on in the city. And then Code for DC, our local Code for America Brigade, that was the new partner for us. We had not really worked with them in the past, so it was exciting to get this opportunity. And so the problem that we set out to address as far as this work went was the need to try to preserve a lot of the privately owned housing in the city that has been affordable, a lot of it because of assistance programs like federal housing assistance through Section 8 or federal mortgages. But with the changing economics in DC and the rise in the housing market, there's a lot of incentives for owners to change from being affordable housing to not affordable housing anymore. So the work of the DC Preservation Network has been working largely on a building-by-building basis to try to address specific threats to affordable housing. But we also felt there was a need for the city to take a more strategic look at the overall picture of what's going on with housing and to use data to try to inform some of the city's strategies about how it uses its own tools and resources to preserve affordable housing. So we thought this would be a great opportunity to use this Civic Tech project to try to address those challenges. There was a number of reasons why we thought this might be a good approach in terms of having a tool that then could be built once and then used in a number of different ways by different stakeholders in the city, to have some data that could provide both, sort of early warning looks at housing as well as some of the greater, more detailed information you need about specific buildings, and to try to facilitate a more transparent and data-driven approach to this work. So we launched in with an effort that included, first of all, hiring a project manager, and that was one of the keys to our success in this project. So Neal Humphrey, who's the fellow standing there to the right in front of the snowman, he was our project manager working on the project, and he helped really organize the volunteer work through the Code for DC Brigade. So here you see one of the meetings. There are many meetings held at least once a month and sometimes twice a month with the volunteers to talk about various aspects of the project, and some of the key stakeholders are there. There's Danilo Pelletier is one of the representatives from the DC Department of Housing there as well in this particular one, but I participated in a lot of these meetings, as did other folks. And a lot of it focused on the design of the tool. So it was a lot of design work that the volunteers really took the lead on doing, in terms of we sort of laid out the basic parameters of what we wanted to achieve, and they did a lot of work thinking about like what kinds of data and what kinds of presentation of those data might best facilitate that work. They did interviews with key stakeholders that we helped identify, and did these kinds of paper mock-ups at first, and these were sort of at the meetings, the volunteer meetings, they would discuss these and go over them. That led to some clickable mock-ups that then could be tested out with different users, and that led to some changes in terms of how it was approached. So you'll see things here in these mock-ups that actually don't appear in the website. So like the boxes in the back there, those volunteers I know spent a lot of time building those little boxes and figuring out how to do that, but then when it came to the user testing, the users just really couldn't understand what that was all about, so it ended up getting scrapped. So that was, so it was a very user-driven process, which I think the volunteers really brought that to the process, and I think that was a great part of it. And in the end, so this is where we've ended up, and this is now available at housinginsights.org, so it's a public website. Anybody can go and take a look at it. And you can see some, rather classic elements here in terms of a map showing where all the housing, assisted affordable housing is in the city. On the left, you have ways you can query the data according to different characteristics. You can also overlay some neighborhood characteristics on top of that to see, different locations in the city and what they're like. There's also a more project level view that you can access as well, where you can see some more details about specific developments. And this is just a small shot of it, because there's a bit more to it than this, including things about who owns the property, and if there's any sort of information in city records about property sales or or other kinds of notices and things that have been filed against these properties. So all data that can be used both at a large scale and small scale to sort of think about affordable housing preservation. So we had a lot of people involved in this project in terms of the volunteers, and that's, again, I think due to the great work that Neal did, helping recruit and sort of organize all that. We had, as you can see, over 100 volunteers involved, 40 of whom wrote code. Others, as I said, did things like user testing and interviews with users. And in the end, we weren't quite sure how this would work, but half of the coding work actually was done by volunteers, and half was done by Neal, the project manager. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad outcome. It's just that I think that actually made a lot of sense in the way that it worked. And we always kind of thought that Neal would do some of the coding. We never really knew what that would be. And that's where we ended up. But, I think that Neal did a great job, again, of providing real opportunities for volunteers to get involved. And so some of them, obviously 100 volunteers, they're not all deeply involved. So there were some who were very involved and others who were not quite so involved. All this work was done open source, and all of the coding work was done using GitHub as a version control, so we actually are able to track, in fact, who did what. And so that's one of the reasons why we can present some statistics about this. So that's kind of a benefit of using that platform as well as just helping organize the work itself. So again, so in the process there was a lot of user testing and iteration that went on. We had a limited time to do this. I think the overall scope was probably done over about 10 months from start to finish, and including like just even thinking about what it is we were doing. So a pretty fast timeline, and we don't consider it a finished product, we consider it a work in progress. But we did do a launch in October, and got a really good turnout of folks to come to hear about the tool. You can see on the left here is a picture of some of the volunteers who were involved, and Neal sitting there to the right. And then standing at the podium speaking is Polly Donaldson, who's the director of the DC Department of Housing and Community Development, who came and spoke about the tool and how excited she was about the partnership and the work we were able to do together. So going forward, now the project has officially ended in terms of our work with the national partners on this project. But as I said, we consider it to be a work in progress. This was kind of version 1, and we want to try to make improvements and enhancements. So for the long term going forward, so Neal has sadly for us moved on to other work and is not as directly involved with this project anymore. But before he left, we kind of came up with a transition plan, which included creating this technical leadership team with 3 of the main volunteers who had worked on the project, who will take responsibility going forward for the front end, back end, and user testing parts of the work as we go forward. We've kind of kept our partners in place as an advisory committee. A new development is that at the Department of Housing, there's a new position that was just created, the DC Preservation Officer, who came on board last month. So she is charged with kind of being the overall DC government person responsible for coordinating affordable housing preservation activities. We've demoed the tool for her. She's very excited about using it as part of her work and helping us think about how to make it more useful. So I will pause there, and happy to take questions later. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
My name's John. I'm from St. Louis, and I'm here to talk about our Civic Tech and Data Collaborative project that we put together here. A little bit of background on what our civic issue was. We have a really fractured municipal system. I know everybody says that, but we have a county with like 90 municipalities, so it's really bad. And there's over 80 courts and a lot of stuff where we're trying to figure out, like, what are these issues? Why are we seeing problems where people are getting predatory policing in areas that are low income and very challenged, and basically forcing people that don't have money to pay money or telling them they're going to go to jail? And we surveyed a whole bunch of people, and we found out that there was no way to get all the data that we needed to get. So we said, let's try to figure out a way to put together an online portal that brings in all these municipalities, all these courts into one location, so that way someone has a place that they can just look up their information and learn if they have a warrant instead of just wondering. And this is what we came up with. It's called your STL court. See, there's maps and ticket locating systems and the ability to find out all the information about your case, where the court is located, where you can go, and a companion text message system as well, so that way you can get the information that you need sent to your phone if you don't have internet access. This is a little bit of a preview of what it looks like. The drop down at the top shows just different court information regardless of if that court participates in our program or not. And then at the bottom there's 3 different ticket locators for ticket number, driver's license number if you lost your ticket, and then a little map to click and figure out, hey, I think I was in this municipality but I'm not really sure, and get information that way as well. This gives us an idea as far as the fractured landscape. Everybody that's in the blue is participating in our system. Everybody in the green will be participating in our system one day, fingers crossed. And the goal is to have the entire region under one system where you can go to look things up, because that's how the messaging is strongest, when you can say no matter who you are or what's going on, this is where you can go and figure things out. This is a little bit of what our stakeholder outreach looked like as far as people that we help to engage with the public with. The coding community, there's an organization called Global Hack, and they put together a big programming competition with cash prizes, and this program was developed out of prototypes from that. And the judges and the clerks were a huge, huge, huge part of all of this. This is what our ecosystem map looks like. It's kind of crazy because there's all these moving parts, lots of people, and us kind of sitting at the middle trying to manage all of this and talking to organizations and entities that don't usually talk to outsiders and don't usually talk to each other. So there was a lot of new relationship building, a lot of trust that had to be built up over time, and it led to a tremendous amount of challenges. All these different municipalities, all these different software vendors, some private, some public, trying to get them to agree to turn over their data, and then you need permission from the vendor and the mayor and the presiding judge and all this kind of stuff. And then we hit the point where they say, well, it's a grant initiative. What happens when the grant dies? So we said, well, we're going to just become our own nonprofit, so that way we'll have accountability going forward, which was fun. Just another set of challenges that are going on. I think this is also a situation where the slides are set to 10 seconds instead of 20, so this is going a little quicker than I imagined. So at the end, I'll elaborate a little bit more on stuff that's going on. But it was very hard to test the software. When you have software that you want to test, you think, I'm going to build a focus group and I'm going to get people in and we'll sit down and talk about it. But the big problem for us wasn't making sure that the functionality worked on the UX side. It was making sure that all the data pipes were actually connected. So think about any kind of software that you've tested. Now try to do it in line with people outside of night court waiting to go in and have their names called, while you're just saying, like, hey, here's a thing, here's us, we're new, you have no idea who we are, but if you plug all your information into our website, it'll tell you all this different stuff about you. And they're like, who are you, what are you talking about, why are you doing this? So it's a very hostile environment. It takes a lot to build trust. It takes a lot to kind of hit the point where people are going to say, yeah, we believe in what you're doing and what's going on, and we're willing to trust this and move forward with it. So there were a lot of challenges that we had with that. We had challenges with staff turnover, myself included, because I did not start this project. When I took this job, this was oh yeah, by the way, this is something that you're going to have to do and manage from Eleanor. So thank you very much. And fortunately, we had a good situation where there was another project co-lead on this initiative that was really helpful and helped to kind of balance out the work that worked in a really, really positive way for all the stuff that we were doing. But it was difficult to make work. Unlike what Neal was able to do in DC, we didn't have hundreds of volunteers, we had 2. They were the winning team that came out of the Global Hack competition, and they helped to volunteer all the way through the process, and they're still helping to manage it now as 2 members of our new board of directors. So they've been really fantastic as far as their vision and ability to see things moving forward, and their ability to help steer things in a way that borders that technical expertise with all the expertise we were able to get from doing the court user surveys and working with social work students at the University of Missouri St. Louis, and all these other different moving parts that we decided it was just difficult to manage from the 2 of us, from somebody who it's a portion of my job and not a portion of somebody else's job. And then we had issues with project manager turnover, issues with people at the county who we were working with and saying, this is great, you want to give us access to your data, that's wonderful. And then they quit and go do something else. And the person who was the intern in their place was like, we have no idea how these systems are run. So there was a lot of fact-finding and helping St. Louis County figure out how exactly their data systems work, where it's housed, how you gain access to it. And things were just, because of government turnover over time, there wasn't any of this institutional knowledge where we could just tap into somebody and say, hey, this is exactly what's going on. So it was very difficult. There was a lot of ebbs and flows with the project where sometimes it felt like it wasn't moving anywhere at all. And I think a lot of you guys have these same kinds of issues where nothing happens, nothing happens, nothing happens. Then it's, oh my God, we have like 3 weeks to get a whole bunch of work done. So we had to be really flexible in terms of figuring out what our timeline looked like, figuring out what our workflow was going to look like, and figuring out exactly what we needed to do to bring all this stuff to fruition. So a little over a year ago, last May, we were able to do the piloting with this in St. Louis County, the unincorporated area, which has about 300,000 people. And then as of last January was when we got to this point where we were able to bring on about 40 some more municipalities and get to the point where it's actually something we can go out and say, this is useful now. Most of you will be able to make this work. And close to 75% of all people in the St. Louis City County area live in a part that's served by your STL courts. So we think this is going to be really helpful. We're hoping that the ultimate goal of this is going to be reducing the number of people that end up in jail over really minor traffic fines. You get pulled over for going 10 miles over the speed limit during rush hour, and then you can't pay, and you're working 2 jobs, and you have 3 kids, and you forget about it. And we were finding out after talking to these people that they're running into issues where it'll be years down the line, maybe 5 or 10 years, and they get pulled over for another minor infraction. Or they end up in some kind of vehicle collision, or maybe their house gets broken into. They call 911 and the police show up and they say, oh, you have a warrant out for missing court 10 years ago, so now we got to arrest you. And then you lose your job, you lose your house, you lose custody of your kids, stuff like that. It's not cohesive to a good, equitable society. And as a community development organization, which is what we are at RISE, we saw this as a very integral part of being able to look at this problem and say, this is what you need to build strong communities. This is the kind of reform that you need at a government level. That's something that people aren't really talking about. You know, we talk about access to data and access to, data reform and what we can do with it. But as far as changing the way the courts actually work, it's almost impossible because it comes top down from the state Supreme Court, and that's kind of just it. So building allies on that front is really difficult. Getting people to recognize this is a problem is really difficult. And trying to get people to figure out this is something that we can do that's really not that difficult once you get all the players at the table is a really hard thing for people to wrap their heads around. And I know it's really difficult when you look at some places that are much more forward-thinking and everyone says, yes, cool, new technology tool, I'm all about it. How do I sign up? I don't have to do anything and I can take credit? Great. Missouri's a little bit of a different animal. It's who are you, what are you doing, why do you want access to this, how can we control this stuff? We talk to people and they say they won't even tell somebody if they have a warrant out for their arrest or not. They say, well, if you come down to the station, we can let you know. I mean, you can imagine how well that works, right? Would you do it? Show of hands. Would anybody do that? No, nobody would do that. So it's so much nicer having a web portal where you can go and look up that information. And you can imagine, you can see some of these lines here. Some of these municipalities only have like 200 or 300 people. Their courts are staffed maybe 1 day a week by a part-time person. So if you have a question, there's nobody you can call. There's no one to pick up the phone. If they're there, they're probably too busy. So this is something that we saw as being able to help the courts, being able to help the people, being able to help these poor court clerks who are like overwhelmed and swamped with data and swamped with phone calls and requests from the judges and the lawyers and all this kind of stuff. So we see this as something that's really going to help everybody. We put together this list of indicators that I'm not going to go through that kind of shows this is all the stuff that we feel is going to be important to track this sort of thing long term. This will be available for download, so please don't write all this stuff down. But that's kind of my 10-minute elevator speech about this project. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to answering any questions you guys have about it.
So we just got to hear a little bit of these projects that have been being carried out over the past couple years, and we're going to probe them for additional information with questions from me and questions from you. But before we do that, we're going to take advantage of having Elizabeth Reynoso in the audience. She was our project lead at Living Cities and has a really great perspective on the project. So we're going to actually start by throwing a question to her, and we're going to, which she is expecting, so it's okay. And we're going to ask her if she has advice for other NNIP partners or other folks in the room who are thinking about reaching out to government agencies and carrying out work like what has been done in St. Louis and DC.
Right. Thank you, April. And thank you, everyone. Awesome presentations, and there's definitely more that we are gearing to share with you. But I had to write down some stuff because there's just so much that we learned. But the valuable relationships that we were able to build with NNIP HQ, but with the sites, is something that we definitely, at Living Cities, are learning that we need to leverage more, and is something that I try to do in any platform that I have whenever I hear there are data challenges in any community or in building relationships with residents. And so I always say, do you have an NNIP partner? Do you know what NNIP is? Because, okay, let me take it from the perspective of government, the public sector folks that we work with, many of them who you are trying to work with, building relationships with. They don't always know what they want when it has to do with like data. And so I know like Danilo in DC saying like, it was better to do this project in this way rather than putting out an RFP for something that we didn't know what we really wanted to get at. And so it wasn't about like developing the relationships so that we can get to the contract. It was about understanding who's working on what in the community and how we can leverage existing knowledge, assets, and relationships. And so also, public sector doesn't always know the information that they have and the information they don't have. I mean, how much that came up in each of our sites about like how to really manage that, but then how to actually use it. So even like training up the staff to ask the right questions to be able to use their data so that they can make decisions, policy decisions, programmatic decisions that impact all of their residents. And then they don't have the know-how or the time to use that information. And so knowing that there is an NNIP partner out there, an NNIP partner who can potentially manage volunteers, I mean, it was so valuable to have our NNIP partners be the backbone organizations for all of this work. Without NNIP partnerships, there wasn't that person like a Neal or someone who could manage a Neal to say, how can we work with all these volunteers? Cities aren't very good at doing that on their own within City Hall. And then cities don't actually know like who are the trusted partners. And you guys have been developing these relationships, helping residents tell their own stories. So I love the example from Los Angeles. The ways in which our partners could better engage residents is one way that, especially our public sector folks, that's one way they can better work with their community, is to say, we've got this data, here's an organization that's using it, and they can help you visualize your own story so you can tell the assets about what's going on and reclaim the stories of your own neighborhoods. So the one way that you can really build a relationship within the city government is to find these data champions by telling them the value that you have. It's in the relationships, it's in the capacities and the competencies that you have, the ability to tell stories in a way that can help them make better policy decisions and programmatic decisions that will affect their residents.
Great, thanks so much. So I have a ton of questions for these guys. I've been able to have the vantage point of a learning partner city in the project, but to be mindful of time, I'm going to throw out one, and I'll check on the time, make sure that you all get time to ask some questions. But my first question is, as we've seen throughout even just these past couple days, NNIP partners often build technology that you might call Civic Tech. So what makes this project different from some of the other data tools and tech that we see NNIP partners developing?
You want to start that, Peter?
Sure. Well, in our case, the difference was we didn't build it. The volunteers built it, and as I said, they really took the lead in terms of the design and working with the users to sort that out. So the tool we built is not the tool that I would have built. But that's okay because I'm not the user. And so, we ended up through that process kind of in a very different spot than it would have been if we had done it ourselves.
I think that's fair to say for our project as well. And what was different for us was that we're managing a lot of people and talking to a lot of folks that are in a space that we typically don't play in. So even though we will build data portals and we will have these data kinds of projects, a lot of them are focused around the kind of work that we do, and we're a nonprofit that builds affordable housing. So one of the questions that we had to answer was, why is a nonprofit who builds affordable housing building a website about court systems? So it was a little bit different in that regard, and it was something that is just, it was just different for us managing external external teams of people instead of just internal teams of people, and trying to build new relationships as we're building the project, as opposed to the old way we worked, which was you build the relationship over time and then you figure out a project that y'all can do together. So this was something that we were trying to manage a lot of moving parts kind of at once.
Great. I lied, and I'm going to ask one more question. And this is the $1 million question, right? Would you do it again?
You can be honest.
I mean, do you mean the same thing again, or?
No, I don't mean the same thing again. Would you take on a project like this again, maybe with a different subject matter or
Yeah,
different
because
team?
I think that's a different, I mean, because I would do what we did again if I was going back in time. But whether I would use this process for a new project, I mean, I think that's a really great question. We've talked about, in fact, doing some things with the Cofer DC Brigade again, and this has been, you know, part of the great thing about the project is now we have that relationship. But on the other hand, you know, just kind of reflecting on this, I mean, I think there's two things that I would think carefully about. So first of all, the issue of, like, you build a website, you're not done once the website is built. Once it's built, you have to keep maintaining it and keep dealing with it. And so, you know, as I said, we have a plan for moving that forward, but what I, you know, am learning, I'm gaining more appreciation for the work that Neal did, because I'm realizing that he's the one who kept all those volunteers, like, moving forward, and now he's not there, so I've got to do it, or somebody else has to do that, because otherwise it won't happen. And so that's a consideration. The hosting and other things that need to be done to keep it up to date is a consideration. And then the second thing for me is, you know, the Code for DC folks, they were fantastic. They're volunteers, right? I'm not a volunteer. I get paid for what I do, and I go out and raise money for projects like this so that we can actually do them. Is it fair for me to do that and then try to use volunteer labor to do the work? Like, that's, you know, so I think that depending on the project, we'd have to think carefully about, like, whether it's equitable and reasonable to structure it this way.
So I think this is absolutely the kind of project I would like to do again, but I don't know if it's the right capacity for our organization to be the lead on it. And I think that especially with something like this that's so heavily government involved and government driven and government data, that it, you know, it's live data. A lot of this stuff, like if you get a ticket yesterday, it shows up in our system today. And it's difficult for us as a nonprofit to be the ones that are championing this effort and kind of broadcasting it and putting it out there. Whereas if it had been championed by the city of St. Louis, for instance, they would have the power of the mayor's office and things like that behind them to better get the word out, better amplify things, be able to better strong-arm people into playing nice, instead of us that have to strong-arm people into playing nice in a much more long and roundabout way, which is kind of just bullying to say, look at all that blue, see, why aren't you doing this, you know? And it works to a certain extent, but I feel like there'd be a lot of things that could have moved faster, could have moved smoother, could have been moved a little bit more efficiently if there was a bigger ship that was kind of just steering this whole thing. So I think it was a really fun project, and there was a lot of ways that we could learn about working with new partners and working with new kinds of projects and new kinds of people that we typically don't do. And I think that our role in the future would be better suited towards being like a lead consultant, or somebody that knows how to work with the data side of things, and someone that knows how to put things together, but the person that's actually carrying the banner, somebody that, you know, carries a little bit of a bigger stick than we do.
Chime in too, April. I think, I mean, the handoff is something we were really concerned about from the very beginning, and government agencies are rightfully skeptical when people come in with a, like, oh, I have a project, aren't you lucky? About, like, well, who's going to be there, you know, the day after the grant ends to keep this going? It's a real question that has to be answered, actually, you know, much earlier than I think we all answered it in this project while we were trying to figure stuff out. Like in Boston, they need to, they love the idea, and they know that it changed the way they did things in the youth employment program, but at the same time, they need to actually rewrite a lot of the code, and they're taking pieces of it, but to actually make it internally useful where they can support it, though some of the work needs to be unwound and redone. So I think that with any of these things, we, Olivia and I have written some things about, like, what is a good volunteer project, what is not. So I think, but coming at it with like, we can do things differently with different partners. That's the piece that I think we all came away with.
Laura from San Antonio. Y'all all started to speak to this a little bit, but I'm wondering in terms of your plans for maintaining and keeping things up to date going forward, does having used Civic Tech in the beginning make any difference for what the plan is? And maybe especially for you two rather than Boston, because it's low-income residents who directly benefit from what you do, and like the municipalities are going to lose money in St. Louis and developers in DC. So, but does Civic Tech mean anything for those of us who might be doing it for planning for the future?
Well, I would say first and foremost, we hope that this won't cost the municipalities money, because if people are paying their tickets and not going to jail, it means they're getting the ticket revenue and not having to pay to put them in jail. So it's a win-win for the cities, we feel like. But I don't think that as far as terms of long-term maintenance, it made a big difference as to whether or not it was a Civic Tech project or an internal project, assuming nothing breaks, as long as the hosting's paid for and the domain works and all of our little things that, build out our container and push it out to our servers and stuff like that work. It doesn't really cost a whole lot of money to keep our site up and running right now, at least with the user base that we have at this point. So the biggest expense was prepaying for the text message system, but aside from that, it costs less than $100 a month to keep this thing up and running, so it's not that big of a deal.
But it is open source.
Yeah, the parts that we were allowed to make open source, we made open source, and so there's a CivTech STL GitHub where you can download all the code and contribute if you'd like to. But there were some things that, because we were working with private software companies who have proprietary code and proprietary APIs, we were unable to make that stuff public, so those are all in private repos on Bitbucket.
Yeah, I think from our point of view, the Housing Insights is a lot more maintainable than other things I think that we've undertaken. So for instance, we actually have another website that does almost the same thing. And again, that was kind of part of just the way things kind of played out because of the user-driven approach. But that website is not open source entirely, and that makes it very hard to maintain compared to this one, which is entirely open source and uses more modern technology. So the way we did the other one was working with a proprietary developer. And even though they tried to make as much of it open source as possible, there were still proprietary elements in it, and that makes it hard to maintain compared to this one. So there was a benefit of doing the Civic Tech in that they had that completely open source mentality, and that was very good.
And I think, and I heard a lot more of it over the last day and a half, but the thinking, I heard it from Portland and others about the APIs and thinking about building from the start, building that automated update in, pulling off of our open data portal from the city. So thinking about that, reducing the maintenance and update on the transactional piece. I think the hard part is the user base. So forget the technology. St. Louis did a fantastic job of communications, but if you were going to keep up a marketing campaign for people to use this, that's money. And I think particularly in the affordable housing, getting people to change the way they make decisions takes time. And it will just take Peter sitting down with the city folks or the CDC folks thinking you should take neighborhood conditions into account, not just the building itself. That's a mind shift that takes the investment on the usability, on that user side. So I think the technology and data are the actually now the smallest part of the problem. Those are set. It's the actual getting it into practice that's the hard part, and takes money and resources and staff time.
Hi, my question is to all three of you. If we have to break down the work that you have done into components, like between scouring for data or going for NDAs and cleaning the data or creating that interface and probably post hoc verification of the data, what are the challenges in each of those components that you would top three? Okay, top three challenges.
So I would say our biggest challenge with that was that we are working with, like I said, there's close to 90 municipalities, over 80 courts, and about 7 different software vendors. And depending on what vendor you're talking to, some of them will have a live API that you can tie right into, and they make you sign an NDA, and that's all well and good, and it's fine, and then you get access to all their stuff, and you can make it work, and it's real time, and it's beautiful. Other vendors will say, well, you can have the data, but we don't have a way for you to tie into our system, so we're going to have to set up a situation where we export a big CSV file every day and FTP it to your server and automatically grabs it, and you put it in your own database and build your own API to access it. Great. Other ones that say, well, we do have an API, but the municipality doesn't pay for it, and then we talk to the municipality, and they say, you said your service was free. So then we have to figure out another way and do the same kind of situation. My favorite was one of these small municipalities we met with that has a population of about 450 people, and 2 members of our team went down to meet with the mayor. And, you know, we have no idea what we're getting into, but the mayor was super cool. He was like our age. He was like actually a software developer. He shows up to the meeting in his cargo shorts and his backpack and his little polo shirt, and he thinks our product is like all awesome, and he's excited. And he's like, yeah, but guys, you got to realize, like, we see maybe 300 cases a year. We manage all of our court data in Excel, so there's nothing to like tie into. So once we get onto like a platform that you can access, we'll let you know, because we'd love to be a part of it. But I mean, just dealing with so many different kinds of data sources, so many different kinds of data management, and then trying to figure out a way where one interface can access all of it and query different data sources and query either something live or something that we're caching or whatever else. That was the biggest cluster that we dealt with for this whole thing. I'm glad that you say so, because it's really not, but we're getting there. It'll be okay one day.
Thank you, John. As a follow-up, do you see a possibility of any center creating a protocol that everybody can follow and kind of standardize the way they collect and keep their data?
The only way that's going to happen is if the Missouri Office of Court Administration mandates that all municipal courts in the state of Missouri have to use their software.
I know there was another question up front here.
May I go? Thank you. I'm James Neal from the Institute of Museum and Library Services. I live in Greenbelt, Maryland, and I work in Washington, D.C. Peter, this is for you. I'm very fortunate to have rent less than $1,000. I love living in Greenbelt, but the issue of affordable housing is very important to me, and I would love to live in D.C. closer to my office. Can you discuss the ways in which your work and the data that you use has a direct impact upon the housing market in D.C.?
Well, I mean, the DC government is actively involved in, excuse me, in trying to create and preserve more affordable housing in the city for people of all income levels. One of the big tools they have is the Housing Production Trust Fund, which is a locally revenue-sourced fund of money that can be used to support either the creation of new housing or preserving and redeveloping existing affordable housing. And so our tool is meant to help the city think about how they use that. So how do they use that money? Where does it get invested, in what neighborhoods, in what types of properties? So the impact is in, we hope, in helping the city make better decisions that provide more opportunities for you and other people who want to live in DC to be able to do that.
Hi, I'm Anna Pender with the Community Foundation for Greater Atlanta. I have a little bit of an end user question. You've started to touch on this a bit, but any lessons learned in terms of, are you tracking usage, actively tracking usage, and in terms of engaging the people that are the key audiences for these tools? Kind of what are tips so that build it? How do you get them to come? What would you have done differently besides wanting more money?
So I'll start. I think it's really difficult when you're trying to do something region-wide to get that messaging across. And we did stuff like when the pilot launched, we ran a radio campaign, and we asked some of our partners to, have social media presence around it and things like that. But we found it was really difficult. And when we were nearing the end of our grant period, because we had all these volunteers that did all this coding for us, we realized, we have some more money that we can spend. And what we did right before the grant ended was we hired a community engagement coordinator to go out there and start talking to local organizations, neighborhoods, community development groups, and raise awareness for the tool and see what's going on. So we track usage. We track usage of both the website and the text message system. And we realized realized that aside from doing like a full-on like TV, radio, billboard campaign, it's really difficult to bring the message to the people. This is not a if you build it, they will come kind of situation, as you all know. So hiring somebody to go out there and talk to people and let them know that this is a resource, let them know that there's folks that they can talk to learn more about it, that's been helpful so far, and we hope that that's really going to bear fruit as far as increasing our usership. Oh yeah, that's right. So the St. Louis County Library was also a really good partner in this, and they've helped to be a place where we can display banners that say, hey, do you have issues? Go to USTLcourts.com and figure it out. They put an icon for direct access to the website on all the library system computers, so they've been really helpful too. And there's a handful of other partners that have done similar things in just the space that they work in as far as letting people know. We have little tear-off sheets that are available at some of the courts that people can go get and things like that. And we'll still do some interfacing directly with court users to just tell them this is what's going on, this is what you guys can use, and they're a little bit more receptive to us the more that we talk to them. So.
In our case, the target audience is a bit narrower, even though, again, the tool is available publicly and anyone can use it, and we do think that, other people will probably want to use it. But we have, the members of our preservation network that I mentioned, which again includes DC government agencies, so not just DHCD, but the Housing Finance Agency, the Housing Authority, we have an Office of the Tenant Advocate, we have probably there's a couple others in there that I'm forgetting, and nonprofits that do either tenant organizing or other kinds of work. So that's kind of we have like a very well-defined audience that we can tap into. So, but adoption of the tool has been like kind of the next challenge that we're trying to get to. So in terms of making sure that we get word out about it to all of our partners, and then getting feedback from them about using it and whether are they using it first or not. If they're not using it, why don't they use it? Because they don't like it, or it doesn't provide the information they need. We do also track statistics on use through Google Analytics, so there's some general information we get there. There's no registration for the site, so we don't track use that way.
Yeah, I got a remark, and it's Bob from Pittsburgh. I got a remark and then a question. So the remark is, it would be neat if across all the cities that are doing tech projects, how much we budget for maintenance and what that includes, because as we budget for projects, we should also budget for maintenance of projects over time. So I'd be interested to see kind of what your costs are around maintenance, because we'd love to be able to pull from your expertise. My question is, what are the capacities and competencies in your civic data ecosystem that made you make decisions in certain ways, whether it was to take more things internal or be able to work outside of your own organization? And you have very different capacities in your ecosystem represented on the panel, and I would just love to hear your thoughts about that.
Sure, I could start. No, it's a great question, Bob. So the partners, Urban Institute, CNHED, DHCD, I would say of the three, Urban probably is the one that could have built a tool if we wanted to. We have in-house capability and tech people who could do that. But it would have to be on Urban's website if we actually built it, and there'd be some other constraints involved with that I think made the choice to, again, part of it was the design of the whole thing, but made the choice of getting the code folks to build it, the completely open source way and have it be more of a standalone project. That kind of made that choice more clear for us. And again, as I said, the volunteers were fantastic. They had competencies and expertise in user testing, in user-centered design, in coding, lots of coding technologies, things that I don't understand at all. But they really didn't know a lot about housing generally. And so having that part of it, where we could, so again, in all those meetings, you saw, somebody from DHCD was at them. I was at a lot of those meetings. Scott Bruton from CNHED went to a lot of those meetings. Spending time with the volunteers, answering their questions about housing and housing data and what are the things that people who work in housing need to know about and need to think about. So that division, I think, kind of worked really well here.
I would say that on our end, there was a lot of similarities as far as having that expertise in our ecosystem from people that are outside of the tech sector and existing only in this world of criminal justice. So we were fortunate to have a municipal judge who was not only on our steering committee, but now also on our new nonprofit board of directors, in addition to all the other people that we talked to as far as the clerks and the other judges and the people that could actually explain to us how this process works, especially when there's different layers of it. So you have all the stuff that's mandated by the state Supreme Court, then all the stuff that's, they just get broken up into districts and they say, this is the way the St. Louis district kind of operates, and their presiding judge tells us what their policies are. And then some of the other lower courts will have other nuances as far as what they want to do and what's acceptable and things like that. So having people that could really navigate that complicated landscape for us was really helpful. I think that the biggest difference between all of us is that the partner cities that had a project, so St. Louis and Boston and DC, we had these civic tech ecosystems that were pretty much tailored around our project, and people that were the learning partner cities like Cleveland and San Antonio, Pittsburgh, et cetera, they're much more just like, let's figure out what we can do as far as a data collaborative that actually works and makes sense, and then figure out projects later. And I think in some ways that's an advantage because you bring together a lot of people that are just very smart and capable and talented, and then you can figure out what y'all want to make work. Whereas our data collaborative, it's not really going to be entirely useful for things outside of the realm of criminal justice. In some cases it will be, sure, but for a lot of those partners, they're specifically tailored to this project. And then as far as trying to maintain it long term and things like that, we just went ahead and prepaid our developers with grant money. So that way they're available to keep doing maintenance and upgrades and stuff like that through a better portion of this year. And then after that, it's going to be, a first come, first serve kind of situation. But we're fortunate that the 2 volunteers who built most of the site are continuing to volunteer. And we have other members of our board of directors who are private sector IT consultants and are certainly capable of doing some of the legwork if we need them to. So we don't really have a plan for maintenance aside from just batting my eyelashes at other board members and saying, if you could fix this, it would be really, really helpful. But, luckily nothing is really broken. The maintenance, like I said, is not too terribly expensive. So most of what we need to do is coming from just wants that we have for the project, like building out an admin panel. So when we need to update a court phone number, we can just go do that and not just dive right into the database. That'll be helpful. Doing some additional UI tweaks and changes, because what we have right now is whatever was built and was quick and easy because the programming side was hard. That'll be helpful. But we've been fortunate that we haven't needed a ton of maintenance stuff. We haven't had any kind of like big crashes or problems that needed a whole lot of attention and was like, we got to fix this now. So we've been very, very fortunate in that regard.
Was there, I thought I had the last question. Oh, okay. All right. We'll give it to you.
Yes. Great, perfect. I'm Paul Sorensen. I'm also from St. Louis, and actually working with one of John's partners on a follow-on project with Global Hack to connect homeless management information systems, HMIS systems, and we're running into a similar problem, right? The software vendors, depending on the software vendor that the continuum of care hires to manage this data, it makes it more or less likely that we're able to get data out of that system, for them to open an API to us, for them to really allow us to do imports and exports. So my question is, because these software vendors, who are often for-profit or proprietary, oftentimes hold the keys to this information about our community, right, about public interest, what are some strategies to get those software providers to better integrate, to be more interoperable, or strategies to get the nonprofits and governments who hire them to understand that should be part of their selection process?
Part of what we had is that we were fortunate there was already some kind of tie-in with third-party software. So we do all this stuff in St. Louis, which is just like mobile ticketing. So as soon as you get a ticket, you're automatically assigned a court date. I had no idea people did that. I think that's awful. Don't make people go to court if they can just pay the stupid fine. But they were all built in a way that was able to be tied into other softwares, but it was just a question of convincing them to give it to us. But if it's a system where they don't have any kind of way to export it into something else, that's much more difficult. And that's where you're basically telling the software provider, you need to build something new or give us direct access to your database, which is pretty much the most terrifying thing you can tell them. You could say the sun's going to explode tomorrow, and they're like, whatever, I've had a good run. You tell them you want direct access to their database, oh my God, no, that's worse than the world ending. So I think that persistence pays off. I think having people in your corner who are going to say, yes, this is what needs to happen, people that can kind of force them to make those sort of decisions, tell them why it's going to be a good business decision for them, to say that this is now a thing that can be a piece of the puzzle that plugs into all this other sort of stuff. Yeah, and branding and everything else. Like, this is like a popular software trend as we see, and you know, we look at all these different solutions, and here's a new project management tool, and look at all this other different stuff that integrates with, and that's why we want to buy it. So it's an outdated software model, and getting people to realize that and being innovative, at least a little bit, not a whole lot of innovative, but just enough so that it kind of plays nice with some other stuff when you need it to, it can go a long way. And appealing to their hedonistic interests, I feel, is going to be the most useful way to doing that.
I mean, there are obviously, and Code for America has been a great influencer on this, about educating governments about smart contracts and owning their data and access to that. And I mean, contracts don't expire all the time. It'll be windows of opportunity, but that sort of longer term education so that when it does come up, they're able to see. And I think there's more examples up there from GovX or What Works or those kinds of folks. The chief data officers are getting smarter about making the deals better so that they own their own data, especially, and I think the federal government has a role in this too, because since that HMIS is funded by the federal flows, so there's data advocacy we can do at the top level, but I think you'll have more traction sooner locally, in addition to just batting your eyelashes.
Yeah, but I'm really good at that.
I know you are.
Please join me in thanking our panel for sharing their experiences and their work.
So we're going to do a quick switch over to Civic Switchboard to hear about the library project before, right before, and then we can have lunch. Do you want us to help time?
Sure, having those from the table?
Yeah.
That's fine.
How much? You had 10 minutes and 5 minutes? 10. Okay, good.
I think because of how short it is and right before lunch, we're not going to do discussion, right? Much. I think we're going to fill up our time. Yeah, there's only one slideshow. It's not going to
Okay, cool. No, it's not.
Okay, super.
Just for the record, everyone. And then, let the record show.
What's your name? Name cards? Do you have them?
I forgot mine.
Forgot yours? Okay.
Yeah, it's right here.
Yeah, I got Jennifer. I'm just saying for the table.
We need those up here. No.
I was just asking them if they have their name cards.
Oh, that's okay.
Yeah.
We can go 5 minutes and move on. We'll take a question.
Okay.
We made lunch like over.
Okay. Flexible.
Mushy.
Cool. Yeah, so Jennifer, we didn't get to check in about this session, but the way that I think we've been thinking about it is roughly 10, 10, 10.
Yeah, but we like on the fly talked to Liz on the bus.
Okay.
So, yeah, we're good. Thanks.
All right, this wasn't officially a break, so if everyone could take their seats. So I had the privilege, as I mentioned at the opening, to be a hanger-on on Tuesday at the pre-session. So, and I think the energy and magic of the room, people were very excited. People who had never, in some cases, even met each other, had a chance to put their heads together and really dig into this. So we're very fortunate to be a part of this and offer both NNIP partners and other data intermediaries that participated a chance to really explore this new relationship. And it's very parallel to the Civic Tech project, where we just needed some, I would say, like seeded experimentation so that we can learn how to do this better and then share our lessons with others. So I'm going to turn it over to the Civic Switchboard team, starting with James Neal.
Good morning. My name is James Neal. I'm originally from Columbia, South Carolina. I kind of pride myself on having lived across the United States. I went to college in Morehouse here in Atlanta, graduated in 1988. I lived in Central Africa as a Peace Corps volunteer. I lived in Ann Arbor, Michigan as a failed PhD student in the program in anthropology. I lived in Boston for 6 years working in academic and scholarly publishing. I moved out to New Mexico as a textbook sales rep for a college textbook publisher, and I've been in the Maryland, D.C. area since 2010. I went to library school at the University of Maryland, and I worked in Prince George's County as a children's librarian, then became head of digital services, and I've been with the Institute of Museum and Library Services now for a year and a half. Just by show of hands, how many of you before this meeting had heard of IMLS? That's good. How many of you are librarians? That's pretty good. My goal was to make NNIP and the Urban Institute aware of libraries and librarians as community anchors as well as community catalysts. So we're going to talk about IMLS a little bit this morning. What do I use to forward? Arrow's not, let's see, hold on. All right, there we go. So who are we? The Institute of Museums and Library Services is what they call a petite federal agency. We are about 70 strong with a budget of $300 million. We sit at 955 L'Enfant Plaza in Washington, D.C., right on the National Mall, next door to HUD and other federal agencies. The things that we do, we're interested in supporting and advancing the mission of libraries, archives, and museums across the United States. Some of our strategic goals involve promoting lifelong learning, building capacity, increasing public access, as well as achieving excellence. IMLS was begun in 1996 through the Library Services Act. It also includes the Museums Act. In our Museums division, we have a specific program related to African American history and culture. This is a brief scenario of our current FY 2018 funding. Total of $240 million, close to $190 million going to the LSTA, 32.5 going to museums, 24.7 going to the African American History and Culture Act, and then $2 million going to museum and library services. To be eligible for an IMLS grant, you need to be a nonprofit library museum located in the United States or its territories or freely associated states. We don't fund other federal institutions, for-profits, individuals, or foreign countries and organizations. International institutions we hope to fund in partnership with domestic institutions. Museums funding also includes things like zoos, botanical gardens, planetariums, aquariums even. I focus on libraries. We focus on public, academic, school libraries, research, and archives. The domains that I function in as a program officer are open educational resources, civic tech, digital inclusion, including broadband access, data privacy and security, as well as ebooks. What makes a successful IMLS grant? We are definitely interested in national impact, relevant significance and innovation, strategic collaborations, which is a highlight of the Civic Switchboard. You see a collaboration between an academic library, a data intermediary, as well as a public library. And then some demonstrated expertise. We're looking for those who are leading in their field to lead us towards better grant making. So we do grants. We also do research, stats, data, and publications. We have national initiatives and partnerships, as well as make policy. We also have our grants to state division, which is the bulk of funding towards libraries. These are formula population-based grants that each state gets every year. It's known as grants to states. The area that I work in is called the discretionary side, the competitive side. These are applications for grants. There are two major programs. The LB21, Laura Bush, 21st Century Librarian Program, which is devoted to professional development for librarians. Then we have what's known as our National Leadership Grants for Libraries, which is what the Switchboard achieved. These are more programmatic grant programs that allow building of capacity, developing new ideas, and being innovative. And we also serve the Native American and Native Hawaiian communities. There are planning grants, forum grants, project grants, and research grants. These are some examples of recent grants that we funded that might be in this wheelhouse. At the University of Georgia, we gave about $50,000 to the law library at UGA to create a data visualization tool that tracks congressional legislation. They're currently in the prototype stage, and we're very proud of this project. Second, Kent State is doing a very innovative project that involves bringing data analytics and business intelligence to a public library scenario, helping libraries serve as economic incubators and developers within their communities. We also have a grant from the University of North Texas in which we're looking at preserving government information. As you know, in the federal government, websites, electronic resources are often not sustained, and link rot occurs, and preservation does not happen. This is a project that hopes to sustain and make or preserve electronic government information. And of course, we're very proud to work with Civic Switchboard and Aaron Brenner. I was very fortunate to go to Pittsburgh last October and meet with his team and participate in a data day at the Carnegie Library. Excellent. IMLS is very interested in funding other projects like that. I think it's a model that can be replicated across the United States. We're interested in building digital capacity, early childhood learning, providing technical assistance to small and medium-sized museums and libraries, and building networks to efficiently impact the museum field as well as libraries. As I said, we're exploring OER, digital inclusion, broadband access. We're also looking at how America is changing demographically. The census is coming up. Librarians and libraries will be called upon to work with the census, as most of it will be online. This is an ongoing effort throughout the library community. We also offer national medals to library systems across America. It's a competitive system in which our board has the major impact after recommendation from the program office. Connect with us. I'm a big Twitter hound. You probably see me tweeting throughout this conference. IMLS also is available via social media. We have Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, as well as Instagram. That's me. That's my Twitter handle. That's my email address. I am very interested in talking to those of you who might be interested in applying for grants with IMLS. It's a very, very good opportunity for the civic tech community to continue to grow and look at libraries as community anchors as well as community catalysts. Thank you.
Thank you, James. I've never been so excited to be able to advance my own slides. I'm Aaron Brenner. I'm a librarian at the University of Pittsburgh. I'm also a member of the Civic Switchboard project team, which is one of the funded projects from IMLS. So we thank, again, as always, IMLS for their support. This is the official name of our project. One of the things that this project is doing already is it's bringing together the library community and the community that's represented here within NIP. And part of the funding from this project was used to support a number of librarians to participate as cross-pollinators here. So if I could just ask those folks to just stand up really quickly and wave, because there's a couple librarians in the audience. Yes, librarians, yes, thank you. So we really appreciate the support that made their participation here possible, and I also hope that those of you in the audience will maybe have already had conversations with them, will continue to have conversations with them. I wanted to begin with a little bit of context because libraries are changing, they're continuing to change, and they're changing in ways. So Kathy, in her introduction yesterday, talked about the overlap in mission between libraries and the NNIP community. I completely agree with that, but I'd also go even further to say that there's sections of the library world whose work activities are moving much more closely in alignment with the kinds of projects and work that I've heard this community is doing. So in particular, in libraries, there's a turn over the last several years more and more to what's local. So as information, what we would call in the library the general collection becomes available in many ways and through many media, libraries are really recognizing the value of being a collector and working in a local context. At the University of Pittsburgh, where I work, even at the institutional level, there's been a refocusing on community engagement at the highest level that permeates the whole organization. Another aspect is that libraries are getting much more interested in the full life cycle of information production, use, and management. So rather than just being there at the beginning when people are doing searches and at the end when the products of work, books and journals are produced and putting them on the shelves, libraries are now working with people throughout the entire life cycle of working with information. They're supporting personal information management, they're supporting analytical tools. So I know in the program later, I think tomorrow morning, there's a talk that features Tableau and story maps. These are exactly the kind of things that librarians are increasingly helping people with. Of course, libraries are increasingly working with data as a form, and there's so much to talk about with how libraries work with data and think about data that could fill other presentations. But librarians, I think, are particularly interested in provenance of data, in data literacy, and understanding context for data, and then enabling social connections. So this has always been a role of libraries, but I think there's an increasing understanding and recognition that a lot of the difficult problems that we need to work on can only be addressed by bringing together people across domains, across different sectors, and libraries are real places for that kind of convening and exchange. So another way to put this, a couple of years ago, David Lankeys, who he currently directs the School of Library and Information Science at the University of South Carolina. So he's training librarians, wrote a book called The Atlas of New Librarianship, where he summarizes the mission of librarians, and I thought that this would resonate here. The mission of librarians is to improve society through facilitating knowledge creation in their communities. Okay, even more, a little even beyond that, or more directly, let's say, there have been a lot of calls for librarians and library workers to work very actively in the community, so maybe beyond the building of the library. So this is an article that's been very influential to our project from Shannon Mattern, who's a professor at the New School in New York. She's a professor of media studies, but studies information in the urban environment. And she wrote this article called Public Information. I'm going to read a little bit of a quote from this article because it's been inspirational and aspirational to us. So she writes, "We must push our civic leaders to bolster their planning teams with experts in the ethical collection, organization, preservation, and dissemination of information resources. Urban data programs should be counseled by professionals who understand the complex issues of equity, privacy, and security. Librarians on the Planning Commission, archivists in the Police Academy, they are the guardians of a critical contextual approach to information, which is a public resource every bit as necessary as streets and sewer lines." I think that probably also resonates quite a lot in this community. So in Pittsburgh, we're not quite to having archivists in the Police Academy, at least that I'm aware of. But the academic library at the University of Pittsburgh, the public library, the Carnegie Public Library, have gotten very involved in partnership with Bob and Liz and the team at the Western Pennsylvania Regional Data Center. We've been doing this over about three plus years now. That also could fill up an entire different presentation, but I think the key thing for this project is that we realized that the work that we were doing in Pittsburgh, we really wanted to see replicated across the country in different communities, but we also recognize that every community is unique, and so we can't say that we have the formula. Can't say to do exactly what we've done in Pittsburgh will play elsewhere. So in thinking of a national project, what we really want to do is stimulate these kinds of relationships in multiple communities of different types, different kinds of organizations across the country. So this is our project team. James mentioned we've got a combination of an academic library, a public library, the data center, and then some really helpful coordination and networking through NNIP. So those are the folks. Project activities, we've got a website where we've written already a couple of blog posts. Although the primary audience for the project is librarians, in part, thinking about our funding source, we also are targeting data intermediaries. So we're looking at both sides of this relationship. So one of our blog posts, which I encourage you all to check out if you haven't, is this one, Data Intermediary Initial Outreach to Librarians, which gives some strategies for building that relationship. That is our Twitter handle, Civic Switch. And then we're also working in the open, more or less, on a guide and toolkit that we're going to develop over the lifespan of the project. So we started this guide and toolkit, which is on GitBooks, with our own perspective and things that we know from Pittsburgh, but to really make this what it should be and to make this meaningful, we want to incorporate as much experience and case studies and perspective from other regions as we can. So stay tuned to that. Overall, the way that I'm really looking at this project is that we're not building a thing, we're not building necessarily a tool. What we're really building is social infrastructure and capacity. And so one of the ways that we've already done that this week is by bringing together 12 teams, which featured, each team had one library person, one library worker, and one civic data intermediary. And they had conversations, and they did some ecosystem mapping together, and they did some preliminary project design together. We're going to do this again in October in advance of the Digital Library Federation Conference, which is in Las Vegas. So this is something that I think we're all thrilled that we can facilitate happening. And the next segment of this panel is a report out from that workshop by some of the participants. So apologies, we should have also had the Shift Lab logo up there, but at press time we weren't exactly sure who was going to be on the panel, but we've got Shay and Jennifer here to talk about their experience, so thank you so much.
Hello everyone, I am Shay Swagger. I am a librarian and I work, I know it's the best, sorry. I work on a area campus, which means that I serve 3 institutions of higher education. So collectively it's about 45,000 students. And so every semester between part-time and full-time students, they do over 11 million hours of work. So hold that in your mind because we're going to come back to that, that's important. The Data to Policy project is what this partnership is formed around. And it came about because in 2015, in response to several high-profile shootings of unarmed African Americans by police, the Black Student Union got together because they were really concerned about their safety. They didn't feel like the police were for them. They felt in danger. And so we had a conversation between our campus police department and the head of the Black Student Services. And it was incredibly emotionally charged, and people wanted to do something. And so I felt like the libraries were a really good place to start having a conversation, and those conversations led to a platform in which faculty members volunteer their courses in which there is some data literacy component or a policy literacy component as a learning outcome. But instead of using hypothetical data, they'll actually use open data from the city of Denver around policing to identify something in policing that could be improved in terms of public safety. And at the end of a semester, they create research posters that use evidence to suggest policy proposals to improve public safety and policing. And then we invite lawmakers and police agencies and people from the city to come in and hear their presentations. Our first one was about 2 weeks ago, and it was super powerful. The point of the 11 million hours is that we now have a resource of 45,000 students that are dedicating a lot of their time and energy to investigate these issues using data to inform policy. And that's not something that I think that we fully realize the potential of. These are incredibly intelligent, passionate people that I get the privilege of working with every day, and the fact that they're invested in doing something like this is really exciting to me. So part of what this partnership I got from and what Civic Switchboard gave me is just actually an introduction. I didn't know Jennifer before this happened. And since then, it's just been an incredibly productive and exciting time to just have conversations with her and learn about what Shift is doing. I had no idea what NNIP was, and now I want everyone to know what NNIP is and does. And so just the workshop itself was a highly structured, intensive time that I think that in terms of the outcome, Jennifer and I probably would have gotten to eventually, but it was because of the intensity and because of the structure, it really jump-started our conversations and gave us a good plan about what we wanted to accomplish, what our network looked like. And then, so NNIP and Shift has connections and resources that the library doesn't have. Trying to actually connect on campus is its own challenge, and so Shift is going to serve as a really important partner in trying to get external participation. So I think that's been incredibly valuable. But to all the NNIP partners out here, I would really encourage you to do what Aaron has been talking about in terms of reaching out, but I have a couple of tips for you in terms of talking to libraries. Anytime you switch an audience, you have to code switch. So there's going to be certain language that's going to be different. So when you're talking to libraries, data literacy is something that they care a lot about. And I firmly believe that neither data or libraries are neutral. That's not representative of everyone in the community, but I think that that actually is one of the reasons why libraries should be at the table. I think we all care for our communities in a very similar way, but also recognize that not everything is fine. We're doing the work we're doing because not everything is fine. So it's okay to acknowledge that. If you can cash out any of the projects you're proposing as either digital scholarship or digital humanities, you get a lot of traction. It's a buzzword that people perk up and pay attention to. But particularly if you can tie into the pedagogical value of using real data from a local community, I think you'll get a lot of currency. The pedagogy is, science of teaching and learning. And when you give students real data around a real issue that affects their life, it changes the way that they learn, and it becomes far more impactful to the learning process. So I'm going to pass it over to Jennifer, but thank you very much. Oh, I have stickers. I don't have a slide, but stickers are pretty fun. So come on over to the table.
Oh, good morning, everybody. I don't have a lot of formal remarks. It was just a great opportunity to be able to share the experience that I had in the workshop and being able to translate that and share some of the benefits that we're already reaping, literally, in terms of the opportunity to get connected through Civic Switchboard in our hometown with Shay. And I think from the NNIP perspective, and specifically our perspective at Shift, is that this notion around furthering our networks locally, like we have, that's been so well developed in this room from our cross-site work and our cross-site relationships, that really this motivation we've had with Shift in terms of to think about how do we really foster an even more robust, localized network, knowing that in full transparency and confession here is like, I get mired and blindered in the day-to-day work, in a lot of our research and our own activities at Shift, but that this really helps extend that view. And we've dabbled here and there, I would say, over the years, and connecting with folks through our Denver Public Library system, but nothing that has really solidified in any kind of formal relationship to where we can leverage each other's talents in ways that you know, we are only going to be successful at Shift in our mission through the extension of all of our partners' work. And by doing that and building this relationship, it was like, it was literally like out of the sky fell this email from Bob, and he's like, hey, do you know Shay? And I was like, no, I do not. And this introduction, and we initially just did a Google Hangout, and we had the opportunity to grab lunch before we came here. And to what Shay mentioned, the carving out of space to really have that intensive planning work was critical, because we already felt this very serendipitous event shaping through this introduction, but to be able to catalyze and figure out our strategy to build out this data to policy project relationship and partnership was something that, you know, we would have gotten to, as you said, but we already have, you know, we went through a lean canvas process, and it was amazing. We're just like, okay, we're doing this and we're doing that, and that's the next steps for us. And to be able to do that, and through the work that we've done with hosting a Mile High Data Day event and the outgrowth that has formed around building our data for social good local network, I think this is an example of how are we realizing a project that our other colleagues and our other partners in our work locally can see the good that can come of it. We're so small at Shift that we certainly don't have the wherewithal to be able to staff up and build, you know, bring in all kinds of different expertise and capacity in-house. And it's through the extension of the partnerships that we realize that capacity and reciprocity, and leveraging the kind of talent that exists through Shay's network, and I know that all the other kind of networks that exist in this room, and I think through that more robust ecosystem that we're literally always, all of us are always trying to figure out how do we crack that net that we will get there through the extension of these relationships, because at the end of the day, I think that's what our work is all about and how we're going to actually advance it. So thank you for the opportunity through Civic.
So I'm going to take 5 minutes of lunch, much to Leah's chagrin. And if there's one question, and I'll just do a plug also for, they have a camp session, so if you want to add your dot to their sticky note. But is there somebody? Oh, Seema? There you go. Oh, very convenient.
Very convenient. It'll use up less time. So thank you very much for all of your comments. But Shay, to your point about digital pedagogy, maybe this is a plug for another camp. What I'm interested in knowing, how do you know that your participants have actually learned? So I think we've had to figure out to code switch, right? When we go to community-based meetings and try to help people understand the data, or even to city government agencies, how do we know that the learning has occurred? And maybe that's a bigger question, and maybe there's resources for this, but I think that's what we're after, is that we can go into a room and potentially do a training, but we may not know that we were successful.
It's a great question. In the library community, there's like all-out war on that question. It's really, really, really hard to know. I actually have been pretty heartened by the introduction of ethnography and autoethnography as a method of educational assessment. Just do some Googling later, like it's not that scary. I don't typically like pre-post assessments. I think they're not very deep in terms of the context that you can get out. I think more qualitative methodologies need to be introduced into how we're doing learning assessments on digital pedagogy, but data literacy, information literacy, it applies to lots of different contexts. I think there is so much value in just asking people, very open-ended, very human, very relational. I think that tends to get undervalued in how we're doing learning assessment, because it's seen as more feminized or more relational or touchy-feely. And I think it's actually far more rich in terms of what you can get out. And if you have some empathy built into your assessment metrics, I think you'll learn more. So thank you.
Great.
Hope that helps.
Fabulous. If we can give the panel a round of applause. So I'm assuming that lunch is the same place we've been eating, at the ballroom down the hallway, and then we regroup here at 1 o'clock for our racial equity and communications workshop. And Shay has stickers.